be part of this training and delivering it, co-training, it just means that I feel like I'm making a very real difference to how people like me and my kids are going to be treated in the future. I think, I don't know what the statistics are on the feedback from people, but I can imagine that it's only, if any, it's only a very, very small proportion of people who go on this training who don't have a use for it when they go back into their day-to-day lives. Even if it's not in their working lives, they will go back to it and it will be useful in their personal lives, because we're everywhere. And we do all sorts of jobs, and there's a lot of us, and actually we are quite a resource. How we think and the sort of thought processes that we go through, and when we see links, like in my brain, I'm sort of thinking of something, and then there's a question somebody has asked, or there's something that's popped up at work, and I think, oh, I wonder about that. And then my brain would just go kaboom, and it'll go back to 15 years ago when I was in a situation wherever, and there was this random comment that somebody made that at that point I looked up, even though I don't know if that was pre-Google or not. And then I'll sort of put that in there, and then I'll put in a little bit of information from a film that I saw 3 years ago, and it all comes together. And I've come to realize my brain working like that is not a bad thing. Just because I get to conclusions faster and come up with more creative ways of problem solving. It's really difficult when you're in a bureaucratic organization. It's just really difficult for people to understand that that is of value.
So can you talk to me a little bit about why do you think the Oliver McGowan training is important? I know you've touched on this a little bit already.
Yeah. I think a key reason why that training is so important, and why sharing Oliver's story is so important, is because people don't know what they don't know. And when you're coming from a position of ignorance in the true sense of the word, then how would you understand that, allowing or enabling somebody to feel comfortable to wear sunglasses inside is okay? So what I'm looking to do is, through delivering this training with you guys, is that the people who attend, take off their preconceived notions of what autism looks like, because autism can present in so many different ways. But also, just because autistic people may present slightly differently and how they come across, some people will be non-verbal, other people will be like me and get verbal diarrhea. So you've got a whole range of people, but it doesn't mean there's not stuff going on in their head. It doesn't mean that they lack intelligence. It doesn't mean that they don't have feelings, because maybe their face doesn't show very many feelings in the way that other people expect. So it's like getting people to stop, and then hopefully remembering me or some of the other trainers that you guys have, and thinking, I remember when I went to that training and that lady said X, Y, or Z. That's this sort of thing. So if I just hang back and don't crowd the person and don't make comments about maybe they've got their hood up and they're inside, or in a medical consultation they're texting me because they don't talk to me. I've had that situation myself when I was trying to get some help from my son, and the professional just didn't get it and was like, well, this person in front of me is making eye contact, so they obviously can't be autistic. And I'm like, seriously? Honest to God, and you're supposed to be a health professional. So that's what that's why it's so important, because that could be the difference between somebody getting the appropriate care and certainly somebody not receiving the worst type of care, the kind of stuff that's going to traumatize them and make it that much more difficult for the next time that person has to interact with a health professional. So it's really important, I guess, is the bottom line, is what I'm saying. Well, first and foremost, this training will mean that fewer people will die. That's pretty bold fact, but that's the key message. It benefits the NHS because when you see the person and you're interacting with the person as an individual and not as a carbon copy of every other person, because we're all different, then you're going to pick up things earlier. You're going to see past some of the masking that people like me end up having to do, because otherwise life would just be that much more difficult, because you wouldn't be able to operate in the everyday world with lots of neurotypicals. So this training basically will save lives. Apart from it being the right thing to do, it's going to save a lot of money in the NHS because you will have fewer repeat appointments. You will be able to catch things earlier before they escalate. You will have, if we're looking at, points win prizes and statistics and, league tables and how health organisations are run and where you are and how many gold stars that you get. If you catch stuff early on, it means you don't have the bigger medical bills associated with a much more difficult and complicated situation. So if I had had the right support when I presented originally as a teenager with anxiety and depression, perhaps I wouldn't have spent the next 30 odd years really struggling. There would be less admissions into residential care. All of these things, it's like, if saving lives isn't enough and making life better isn't enough, then look at the bottom line in things like, if you're going to get sued because of shoddy practice and because of a lack of communication between both patients, relatives and staff, it's expensive getting it wrong on a purely monetary level. And I think that is something that the people who hold the purse strings really need to get their head around. The fact that the Oliver McGowan Training, you guys are flexible enough and understanding enough of difference that it's okay that I can co-deliver the training from bed if I need to, or if that works best. If there is a local one, then that's fine. I can get out to that and do it locally, but I'm still making a difference even from bed, which is just like fantastic. It's like doing something I love, making a difference, even though I can't do X, Y, and Z, is just, it blows all of those preconceptions out of the water. So yeah, it's really good, because I mean, what else are we here for really, other than to help people? There's not much point in much else. So yeah.
My next question is, have you ever had a bad experience of your own in a healthcare setting? Or a good experience even?
Oh, I'd say I've had quite a few of both, really. Right, let me think for a second. It's often easier to think of the bad situations rather than the good situations. So I'll see if I can pop one of those out. I think, yeah, the first one that comes to mind is actually when I was a teenager and when I was in that phase of not being able to go to school. And at the time, psychologists and psychiatrists that, yeah, I feel like I'm really old now. I'm not that old. But at that time, it wasn't really a thing that children went to a psychologist or psychiatrist. And also they weren't available on an equivalent of the NHS. So it was actually quite an expensive thing to go and see one. And unfortunately, the first thing that the guy said to me, he was like, all right, well, I'd like you to draw a picture. And draw a picture of the first thing that comes to mind. Well, in my mind, there's like 6 million different opportunities of what could I possibly draw a picture of. And then I started doing picture. I thought, that's a really crap drawing and I can't possibly show that to this guy and everything. So my brain was doing all of these different things. And given that he was a trained psychotherapist, he didn't pick up on any of it at all. He just didn't. He didn't ask the right questions, or he just didn't get the fact that I wasn't getting what he was saying. There was no reassurance as to, don't worry about, how good you think you are at art or anything. He didn't say to me, the reason why I am asking you to do this is because from his perspective, I was still a kid, really, wasn't I? But I wasn't just a kid. I was a kid who'd had all of these years of all of this stuff happening, which had resulted in me being in his office. And one of the things he said to me is, don't worry, anything that you say here, I know nothing about you. That was the phrase. And I was immediately, my brain went, well, you don't know nothing about me because my mum is sitting out in the waiting room and, and you're going to be talking to her afterwards. So there was no reassurance that what we said as a therapist and an individual was going to be kept between us. And I also knew at the back of my mind, we weren't going to be able to afford for me to come back to this guy. So really, what was the point? So I just shut down and we didn't get anywhere. So bearing in mind that that's around more than 30 years ago, and I can still remember those phrases in my head. The medics that are out there now and the social care people that are out there now, you need to be very aware that what you say and what you do can echo for decades. You need to up your game, really, in a lot of cases, would be the bottom line. I had just about got my ME diagnosis. And at the time, I was in a pretty difficult situation because I hadn't been able to continue with my business. So I was now reliant on benefits for my income. I had 2 young kids. Due to health stuff, my main relationship had broken down. So I was now a single parent. Because of all of the above, I was in what was to me a huge amount of debt. And there was a CPN, community practice nurse, mental health team, and she obviously picked up on the fact that I was beating myself up over having got into debt. And somehow she could see that from my expression and how I was presenting. And she turned around to me and she said, do you know, Lorraine, getting into debt does not make you a bad person. And whoosh, that was it. That was the one bit of information that made a huge difference in my health. So you've had one example where what somebody said, horrendous repercussions for decades, and another example of when somebody said the right thing. And I guess the difference between them is that the CPN looked at me as a person and actually looked at my body language and took the time, it seemed, to have read my notes and was able to put it all together. So I think if people who come to the Oliver McGowan Mandatory Training can go away with even a handful of pieces of kit in their toolbox of coping strategies and how to interact with the patients that they're going to be interacting with, then I think that's a massive bonus